So Tom Scott joining us is a lecturer and a Green Party activist who's also been a prominent anti-Brexit campaigner over the last 3 years. And earlier this year, or last year I think, wrote a report on abuses of social media during the referendum campaign, which has been presented in the House of Commons and the European Parliament. And I'm also told his anti-Brexit versions of sea shanties have been sung by hundreds of Cornish protesters at Westminster as well. So we might get a touch of that, but I think mainly on the civil liberties theme. Tom, over to you.
I won't be singing any sea shanties tonight, you'll be pleased to hear. But thank you, Tim and Lynn, for asking me. And thanks, Martin. That was a really interesting talk on the policing aspect. And I think you are right to be concerned about the role of the big tech companies here. That's something I've been looking into along with Molly, the civil implication, privacy implications of that. The situation at the moment is that the government has said that it plans to develop an app which can help keep track of people who may have been exposed to the virus, keep track of the contacts, people they come in contact with. And at first glance, I think this seems like a very sensible thing to be doing. Other countries have been using this kind of technology, contact tracing apps, successfully in China, in South Korea, in Singapore, and some other places as well. And other governments in Europe are also developing similar technology. And I think if they're used responsibly, in combination with widely available testing, and that absolutely has to be there, otherwise there's really no point in trying to use such apps. But they could indeed be an extremely useful tool in trying to help prevent further waves of the virus overwhelming the health system in future as we come out of the lockdown. But there are some really serious doubts, I think, about whether the government is taking a responsible attitude to doing this. And one of the things that has rung a very loud alarm bell for me is that the government's let it be known that it's working with a company called Palantir. I don't know if any of you have heard of Palantir. It's one of the largest, but also the most secretive of the big tech data firms. And it's run by an American far-right billionaire, guy called Peter Thiel, who's also a major donor to Trump, by the way. And this news was announced by a guy called Matthew Gould, who is currently developing, he's basically driving this data project for the government. And looking into his background also rang some alarm bells for me. He's basically been at the heart of the British intelligence establishment for the last 2 decades. At one point, he was the British representative on the Joint Intelligence Committee in Washington. So basically, he was the point guy between British and American intelligence services. And he's also a former ambassador to Israel. He's basically been working very closely with the intelligence services for most of his career. And I think it's more than possible that this connection to Palantir came through his US contacts, intelligence contacts. Whether or not that's the case, we know that Palantir has worked extensively for the American government, security agencies in the States, including the CIA. It's a massive company worth around $9 billion. It is far more secretive than even the other big tech players, than sort of Google and Apple and so on. But we know that it has a wide range of clients, and basically its business model is selling data and analyzing data to clients in a whole range of different fields, commercial, but also political. And there's good evidence that Palantir worked closely with Cambridge Analytica to develop the psychometric data driven stuff that was used to target voters in the 2016 referendum. We know that because the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, has told the House of Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee about it in detail in 2018. So I think it's really deeply concerning that the government sees Palantir as a suitable partner to be developing any kind of data project. the link to the biggest data abuse scandal in history and to the US establishment, intelligence establishment. And in fact, its whole business model suggests that it's absolutely not a suitable partner of that kind. But there are also questions, I think, around the role of another company called Faculty, which is an AI startup, which is very closely linked to people involved in the kind of vote leave cabal, which is, in my view, basically the government, and in particular Dominic Cummings, who is the campaign director of Vote Leave. The brother of the CEO of this company is a guy called Ben Warner. He's the former commercial director of the company. He worked with Cummings on Vote Leave's referendum campaign, which was found by the Information Commissioner to have committed very serious breaches of data protection laws. The ICO, the Information Commissioner, also found that Vote Leave had illegally used a Canadian company to process data and target US voters with this in ways that nobody had given permission to use the data in that way. And Ben Warner then went on to run the Conservative Party's private election modelling during the last election. And these worries, fears really, that the kind of personal data collected by a track and trace app might not be treated responsibly, these were very much exacerbated last week when The Guardian reported that it's seen a memo, a government memo, saying that ministers will reserve the right to de-anonymise that data that's collected through the app. It's not at all clear under what conditions that data might be de-anonymised, but that would really be pretty serious, and it's not at all clear who would have access to that data or on what basis that decision, such decisions as to how to use the data would be taken. As I said, none of this means that this kind of technology can't be useful. Smartphone technology, including GPS geolocation tracking, they are potentially useful tools. But I think the key to this is to do it in a way that doesn't expose citizens to unacceptable levels of individual surveillance, and indeed potential, very possible, likely abuses of their data. And there's another reason why this is really important, I think, and that's that if people are going to trust this app and actually sign up to use it in large numbers, they will need to trust that the government will use their data responsibly. So working with Molly, we come up with 4 what we see as essential principles that should be followed in developing and rolling out any such technology. So I'll just very quickly go through those. The first one is transparency. It needs to be absolutely clear how the data gathered in this way is going to be used and who's going to have access to it. And I have to say this isn't the case with some of the apps that are being used in other countries, in South Korea, for example, where data gathered through a very extensive system of surveillance, including not just smartphone technology, but also CCTV cameras and so on. That's been used by the police to publicly shame some individuals. And this has actually deterred others from taking up the app that the South Korean government is offering. The second principle is anonymization. We think that any personal data gathered by such apps should be properly anonymized so that it can't be used to identify particular individuals, either by the state or by corporate interests who might be acting with the state as partners. And there are ways of doing this. There's a very interesting project among several different European universities called the Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Project, which is essentially a system that allows this kind of anonymized data to be collected and used to alert people who maybe have come into contact with infected individuals, but without that data being centrally stored on a government database. So it is possible to do that. And that's what we think the model this country should be using. And that would avoid the risk, if you like, of surveillance creep by the state or by corporate interests. The third principle is that it should be voluntary. People should be able to opt in voluntarily to use of this app. And that, I think, has happened in Singapore, which has quite a good system of keeping this data under strict control, only keeping it for a limited time. And as a result of that, people have voluntarily opted in to use the app in quite large numbers, and it's been used quite effectively. And fourthly, it's the choice of responsible partners. There are not-for-profit partners who I think could be very usefully used here. For instance, the universities who've been working on this anonymized data project. They've got a lot to offer. I think there's also a very interesting joint initiative between Google and Apple, which is based on a very similar system of anonymization, which has kind of protection of the privacy of the data absolutely at its heart. I'm not usually a great fan of either Google or Apple, but they seem, in this case, to have got it right, I would say, in the way that they're thinking about developing these apps. And this, to me, makes them look like much more suitable potential partners to the UK government than a company like Palantir, which absolutely should not be trusted. So as things stand, I think there is a very real danger that surveillance measures introduced in the wake of this crisis, and as Jenny has been describing, with very little kind of legal or parliamentary oversight, they could be extended way beyond their ostensible purpose. And that is very much what happened in the United States in the aftermath of 2001, the 9/11 attacks, when sweeping powers were given to the US security agencies through something called the Patriot Act. And many of those powers are still on the books. They have not been taken away from the agencies. So we need to be very careful, I think, that that doesn't happen here. And there is a very real risk of that happening.